BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNid88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I am your host, as well as the creator of AstroPsych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the TeeSpring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin.
Okay, hello everybody. Today is Friday, another Anything Goes Friday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? Hope everyone had a good week. So today I'm going to be talking about David Berkowitz, the .44 caliber killer, but he was perhaps more famously known as the Son of Sam. And I would like to give a shout out to Daniel Webster, who requested an episode about the Son of Sam shooter. And as you see, this is a topic that was requested by one of the listeners. So if you guys have any ideas for future episodes, you can put them in the comments section down below. I'm really trying to get to more of your requested topics for the Anything Goes Friday segment. But of course, if you have questions about the Zodiac Killer, I do a segment every Monday about the Zodiac. And on Wednesdays, I do a segment about Jack the Ripper. So all questions and requested topics are welcome. If you have something larger that you would like to share, you can send it to me privately at BlackBoxOnlineRadio@AOL.com. That's very good for sending documents, attachments, images, all those sorts of things. BlackBoxOnlineRadio@AOL.com. You can find that in the description box. And in the description box, you can also find a link for BuyMeACoffee.com. BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNid88. That website allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. Now, as far as the Son of Sam shooter goes, I would like to make two things very clear. There are theories that I will be exploring in this episode, and this is going to focus a lot on some of the psychological aspects of the case, but there are lots of channels out there on YouTube that talk about serial killer psychology. However, I noticed that a lot of them do not examine alternative theories, and I think with the Son of Sam case, it's almost an absolute necessity that somebody does that, because there is a very large alternative theory out there, and that is that David Berkowitz was not the lone gunman, that he was not the only person involved with the Son of Sam murders. And this becomes heavily promoted by an individual named Maury Terry, who wrote the book The Ultimate Evil. And not only that, but David Berkowitz also admitted on national television in an interview with Maury Terry nonetheless, as well as in other interviews such as the one with Larry King that he did in 1999, that he was not the lone gunman. He stated that he was responsible for 2 of these shootings, which led to 3 murders. But what exactly is in place? Which version of the events is correct? Let's look at some of these psychological markers in this story. And to provide some introductory information, I'm going to go over to murderpedia.org and look at the profile for David Berkowitz. David Berkowitz was the Son of Sam shooter, also known as the .44 caliber killer. He was born under the name Richard David Falco. He was adopted and given the name David Berkowitz. He was a serial killer who claimed that the neighbor's dog Harvey was possessed by an ancient demon named Sam, and that it issued commands to kill. He was responsible for 6 murders between 1976 and 1977. He was arrested on August 10th of 1977. David Berkowitz was born on June 1st of 1953. The names of his victims were Donna Luria, Christine Freund, Virginia Voskarichian, Valentina Soriani, and Alexander Esau, and Stacy Moskowitz. The method of execution was shooting using a .44 caliber Bulldog revolver. These crimes took place in New York City and New York State, USA, and he was sentenced to 6 life sentences in prison on June 12th of 1978, making his maximum term 365 years. Now, as I understand, you do not get to avoid a trial for first-degree murder. If you were to enter a guilty plea for first-degree murder, they still have to do a trial. I've talked about several other cases like that here on Black Box Online Radio. But David Berkowitz entered guilty pleas to second-degree murder to avoid the trial. He said he wanted to get it over with. They did not have a trial, but they did have sentencing in the courtroom, and he made some very, very provocative statements toward the victims' families, and they started shouting at him. And an individual named Nisa Moskowitz, who was the mother of Stacy Moskowitz, retaliated heavily. However, she then went on to become friends with David Berkowitz later on. But to look at the psychological aspects of the case, I would like to be citing some information from the Serial Killer podcast, which did a 6-part expose on David Berkowitz as the son of Sam Shooter, longer than most of the other creations over on the Serial Killer podcast that is all available here on YouTube. And there is also some counterclaims that are going to be made by Dr. Todd Grande, who runs a very popular YouTube channel here. The first is, on the Serial Killer podcast, the host Thomas Viborg Thune said that David Berkowitz was a paranoid schizophrenic. And this is something that Dr. Todd Grande disputed by saying that there are people who believed that he was a paranoid schizophrenic, but it really wasn't cut and dry, and that is not something that is universally accepted in the medical world as well as the psychological communities. Firstly, he was given the initial diagnosis of clinical psychopathy with malingering tendencies. And I've always pronounced this word malingering, but Dr. Todd Grande is the doctor, so we are going to go with his pronunciation, malingering tendencies, meaning more or less that he was making it up or fabricating certain details and aspects of his mental health issues. And almost certainly we have to begin with this whole concept of there's this dog that the neighbors have. The dog's name is Harvey, but there's this demon that lives inside the dog named Sam, and that is the one that's giving David these commands to kill. Dr. Todd Grande wanted to point out that David Berkowitz even made a clarification that the dog was not talking to him directly. Not like he's looking at the dog and the dog's mouth is moving and having these conversations. He initially presented it as he was communicating telepathically with the demon named Sam that was in the dog, but David Berkowitz would go on to recount that and state that it was a silly story. It's something that has turned into a joke, and in later interviews he goes on to say that he didn't ever communicate with the dog. He doesn't want to talk about it because it's a distraction, it's something embarrassing, and he regrets ever saying that wild and wacky story. So I definitely tend to agree with that. I know we've just said that he has been diagnosed as somebody who makes up things and does not say things that are always true, but I do not believe that David Berkowitz ever had any real conversations with this particular dog, or that there's any actual type of thing going on in his mind where he's communicating with the demon Sam. I believe that all of that was a fabrication by somebody who was psychologically demented. Absolutely, absolutely, very deranged, but I don't think that he actually had those episodes. I think that that was something that he made up, and he goes on to say some things later on in interviews, particularly in the 1999 interview with Larry King, as well as an interview that Maury Terry did with Inside Edition, where he interviewed David Berkowitz, and he said that these were things that he made up as a justification to commit these destructive actions, to commit the murders, and to go along with the murders. These were things that were something that he could do to tell himself that what he was doing was justifiable. But as far as his type of psychological state, there was this meme on Facebook that I always talk about here on Black Box Online Radio that said, you're watching a serial killer documentary, and they say, the serial killer spent all of his time alone, and he had no friends, and he was alone every night, just like you. But of course, that's not true of all serial killers. I've always disputed that not all serial killers are loners or lone wolf types or hermits or people who are just cut off from society. Some are and some aren't. For example, Ted Bundy, whom I was discussing recently here on Black Box Online Radio, was somebody who was very involved with local politics. He was very outgoing. People would always describe Ted Bundy as charming. And not only that, he had functioning relationships. He had real relationships, intimate relationships. John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown, another serial killer who had all types of social interactions. He was famous for hosting the biggest 4th of July party on his block, and he was very involved with all types of human interaction. He did a lot of his destructive tendencies behind closed doors, and he buried the bodies in the crawl space. Ted Bundy would also lure people into vulnerable situations and murder them. But not all serial killers are lone wolf types and don't have any friends. However, we find David Berkowitz. And he really was somebody who dealt with a lot of isolation in his youth, not being able to bond with the other children, as well as being bullied, being made fun of a lot. And I think that all of this turned into just a giant effect of feeling like he was neglected from society. And one point, though, that David Berkowitz wanted to make very clear in the interviews that I've watched with him is that he did have friends at certain points. But by the time the shootings had started, his friends had either moved away from the area or they were getting married or he had grown apart from them. He isn't somebody who just spent his entire life dealing with types of isolation and turned into some type of recluse. But there are other murderers that end up like that. And Thomas Viborg Thune did a very interesting comparison between David Berkowitz, the son of Sam shooter, and Elliot Rodger, the Isla Vista shooter from California, who's also known as the Virgin Killer. However, I hate that name that has been attributed to him. And what he said was that Elliot Rodger is somebody who had the inability to form relationships. He had the inability to bond with people. He had some genuine type of antisocial tendencies. And when we say antisocial, it's not only about not wanting to talk to other people. It means going against the social norm. And I absolutely believe that that is true for David Berkowitz. I just think that Elliot Rodger was a much more extreme case of that. And Elliot Rodger, as previously stated, committed the Isla Vista shooting, and then he went on to commit suicide, whereas David Berkowitz was involved with something that was much more complicated. But first, I will point out that another clear example of a serial killer who spent all of his time alone and just was an absolute recluse was Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. It is true, some serial killers do spend an enormous amount of time just living in their own mind and developing some types of bizarre obsessions with people, or they feel neglected from society. They have sexual urges, but they can't have any possibility of obtaining an intimate relationship, so they resort to destructive tendencies. The whole concept of a child who is not loved by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. Now, Dr. Todd Grande said something else that was very interesting about the Son of Sam, and I've used this in several other episodes because it's all related to serial killers, and that is that David Berkowitz was a sexually motivated serial killer, but he did not have physical contact with the bodies. For example, some sexually motivated serial killers commit acts of rape, maybe even like Bundy and necrophilia, or like being a necrophile, but with David Berkowitz, that doesn't appear to be the case. It appears that he had some type of genuine sexual urge and desire that he was trying to satiate by committing the crimes. I just mentioned Ted Kaczynski, who was another lone wolf serial killer, and the exact same thing has to be said of Kaczynski, that he was not even getting into any type of shootings with the victims. Ted Kaczynski is the Unabomber. He's mailing bombs, but he has some type of sexual connection to the crimes. He has this almost sexual desire to build the bombs and take them apart, spending 100 hours to build a bomb that takes 9 hours to build. He's building it and disassembling it and building it again, and it's sexual motivations that do not have exact sexual contact. And the reason why I always bring up the example of the Son of Sam case is because Dr. Todd Grande said in his video about the Zodiac killer that he believed that there was that the Zodiac was a sexually motivated serial killer who did not have physical contact with the bodies, the same way that David Berkowitz, the Son of Sam shooter, was operating. And I think that there's a very strong case for that. And there's also something important to note that I don't even remember which source shared this exactly, but it talks about how Ted Bundy was heavily influenced by pornography, as well as having some type of bizarre and twisted infatuation with women. And David Berkowitz also was influenced by pornography to the point where he's having these bizarre fantasies about women, and that he just has no strategy or action plan to deal with women, so he goes on to become more and more destructive. And Thomas Viborg Thune did share something by saying that he develops a very, very odd obsession with the first victim, the first murder victim, that is Donna Loria. Even though I read off the names of these 6 victims in the Son of Sam case, there were other victims that were also shot by David Berkowitz. And it's also possible that he committed 2 crimes previously by trying to murder people with a knife, and that wasn't effective, so he went on to murder them with a .44 caliber. But there is actually a set of there's a set of news reports that have been assembled about the Son of Sam shooter that are available here on YouTube for free, and they are made available on the channel Hezekiah TV. Hezekiah News and Films, excuse me. Hezekiah News and Films is the name of it, and they talk about how David Berkowitz was actually somewhat of a good shot in the army when it came to rifles, but he was actually a very mediocre shot when it came to using a pistol. However, that went on to become his weapon of choice. So, I mean, that just goes to show you that I think that it was all about practicality in relation to committing the crimes the way that he did. But on Hezekiah News and Films, they also point out that psychological profiling became very important for trying to create this image of the killer. They created this task force to try and find the son of Sam shooter called Operation Omega that spent $90,000 a day on trying to find out who the son of Sam shooter was, and they had a team of 45 psychologists working on the case to compose a psychological profile of the killer. And what they said was that the killer was between 25 and 32 years old, and he had an athletic build. And this is something that was a little bit close in the sense that David Berkowitz was 24 years old when he was arrested. However, I mean, I certainly don't think that he had an athletic build. I mean, he's somewhat of a lumpy individual, and he was even teased as a kid for being too chubby. And I mean, there's so many things that I just want to share with you immediately, but let's go through some of this one by one. The first is that I don't believe that growing up and being teased was the only major factor that David Berkowitz had in creating his destructive tendencies. Another one is that he was adopted and that he did not, he learned some very tragic news about his biological mother, and that is that she had another child, a daughter, who was his half sister, and she chose to keep that child but to give him away. And that can also be viewed as a type of betrayal, or the brain can be processing that as that his mother was supposed to take care of him and supposed to love him, but she ended up abandoning him more or less in his own mind. So then that just leads to the desire to create destruction in society, feeling that he is not loved, feeling that he is just living in this bleak world with sexual desires that he's unable to fulfill. So what does he do? He just brings destruction about it because he felt miserable, so he wants to share misery and export misery throughout the world. Well, I don't really think that that is any type of genuine justification. That is absolutely wrong. Yes, we talk about serial killers because we want to try and understand their behavior. We want to try and understand what would drive somebody to kill, but we need to have the strong reinforcement that even if somebody's been through tragic events in their life, that is absolutely not acceptable behavior. And to go on to something that is a little bit different, because this is one of the points that will get into Maury Terry's theory about the ultimate evil, and that is that there were multiple shooters, that there's this group called the 22 Disciples of Hell that are going to be responsible for the crimes, and it's not only David Berkowitz. Now, I need to be very, very clear about this. There are some people who accept this theory, and there are those people who reject the theory. But let's look at the evidence in favor of there actually being multiple shooters in the Son of Sam case. Number one, David Berkowitz admitted to it. As previously stated on national television, he ultimately said that he was responsible for two of the shootings, which saw three murders, and then the other crimes were not him. And then there's David Berkowitz was not only able to convince some people in the general public that, as previously stated, he also convinced Nisa Moskowitz that he was not the shooter of Stacy Moskowitz, as well as Carl De Niro, who was a victim in the second shooting. Carl De Niro, of course, would go on to survive, and he actually wrote a book about it that has an even more famous subtitle than it does its title when it talks about why I was not shot by David Berkowitz. And David Berkowitz went on to tell Maury Terry, again on Inside Edition, he um that he was not responsible for the shooting of Carl De Niro. Instead, it was a woman. Maury Terry asked him a direct question, and he said that women were involved with the shootings, and he could say with certainty that Carl De Niro was shot by a woman, and that Carl De Niro went on to investigate, and he said that he was even able to identify the woman, and this is all shared in interviews here on YouTube. Carl De Niro is even featured in an interview with Larry King from 1999, and that he is saying that the son of Sam did not shoot him, that instead it was a woman. And the evidence in favor of that is that there are multiple composite sketches in the Son of Sam case that did not come from surviving victims, because as we've learned from the Zodiac Killer mystery, there are multiple types of witnesses. There are the people who are actually being in the heat of the moment, who have bullets going through their bodies, and they're expected to try and remember the details of somebody around them. But then there are also witnesses who are just innocent bystanders, who are not being under the threat of fire from the killer. And you had all of these different composite sketches in the Son of Sam case, and ultimately they were like, hey, these people don't look the same. Some of these people look female, some of these people look male. And that is a piece of evidence in favor of Maury Terry's theory. But I'm going to take a very strong stance and I don't know how well this will be accepted, but I do not see anything overwhelming to suggest that there ever was a second gunman in the Son of Sam case. I mean, yes, okay, you have the different composite sketches, but composite sketches very frequently look different. And I always go back to the story of the Golden State Killer, where there were multiple composite sketches, and some of them captured his features, some captured the eyes, some captured the jawline, and none of them were perfect. And I think the same thing is going to be true of the Son of Sam case. But it's important to note that David Berkowitz admitted to involvement with all of the crimes. He said that he was either a scout or a lookout, finding locations, that he was an active participant in all of the shootings that took place, and he was in the area for all of them. Therefore, he would still be some type of accessory to murder. So taking the fall for this group, the 22 Disciples of Hell, that would not necessarily be like anything, any gesture of good faith. Instead, that would just be something that, well, I mean, he honestly was an active participant in all of the murders. But here is something, though, that was shared on the Serial Killer podcast, and that is that David Berkowitz never truly apologized for the crimes. And at the same time, Thomas Viborg Thune, the host of that program, read off this section that was available on David Berkowitz's own website. I mean, he didn't make the website himself because he's in prison, but other people made the website on his behalf, and it's called ariseandshine.org, not ariseandshine.com. That's like takes you to some like Korean woman bathing or something like that. Ariseandshine.org, and there is a very public apology that was made by David Berkowitz when he says that he is extremely sorry for the actions and the pain and suffering that he has brought on to the families and the victims and everything. But what Thomas Viborg Thune said was he never actually admitted to committing all 6 murders as well as all of the shootings, and that just goes to show you that he is a liar and is not telling the truth. And I was going to play that clip for you guys. I was going to play a 3-minute clip of the Serial Killer podcast, and I was going to tear the guy a new one. I was going to go off on some giant tirade, but in all seriousness, once I actually thought about it a little bit more, I mean, what an idea. I thought about it a little bit more, and I started to agree with him, and by stating that Thomas and I are mostly in agreement that the crimes were committed by David Berkowitz, but he did not say that he was the shooter in all of them, meaning that he's under the impression that David Berkowitz was just spinning a web of lies, and he has a particular narrative that he is using to try and deceive people, all going back to that initial diagnosis, psychopathy with malingering tendencies. He does not always tell the truth. He is someone who is just trying to create a narrative, trying to create a picture of how he wants people to perceive him, as opposed to how he's actually behaving. But at the same time, I can give a little bit of leeway by saying that if David Berkowitz has admitted on national television that he didn't do all of the crimes, well, then it would absolutely be worse for his reputation. And yes, I know he shouldn't be a liar, but maybe what he's thinking in his own mind to actually talk about, well, the psychology of the after events, I mean, that would be something that I could understand why he would keep the lie going, because he doesn't want to be found out. He's trying to say things he's trying to actually seek forgiveness from the family, or not even seek forgiveness. He's trying to apologize, and it would absolutely ruin the apology if he would say, "Oh yeah, years ago when I was on television being interviewed by Maury Terry, I made it all up to play mind games with him." And that's just simply what people think about. And this is even shared in the documentary Sons of Sam, which is available on Netflix. It talks about how David Berkowitz played Maury Terry. He learned about his book. He learned about his research. He learned about his theory. And I shouldn't even say that he learned about his book. He learned about Maury Terry's theory and information. And he did some pre-planning for the interview. And he told Maury Terry exactly what he wanted him to hear. And that more or less just turned into the web of lies that I was just talking about. But I think that is very important to note, very important to highlight, because the one time that I actually saw signs of deception in David Berkowitz was when I was watching the Maury Terry interview available on Inside Edition. It's all the segments are here on YouTube in one continuous episode that you can watch and listen to for free. And that is that when he was talking about Carl De Niro being shot by a woman, and that it just seemed like he was not telling the truth. And I wish that I had something better to offer than a gut instinct, but it's almost like how he's just kind of thinking it over. Oh, well, should I actually say this? And I'm not a body language person. I don't even try to get into the world of body language experts. But sometimes, you just hear somebody telling you a story, and then you begin to think, wait a second, is that really true? And my ultimate answer was, I did not think that David Berkowitz was telling the truth in that particular interview. But David Berkowitz has tried to reform himself as a model inmate. He works a lot with counseling. He works a lot with prison ministry. He was a born-again Christian. He says, though, that although he is a born-again Christian, he is still Jewish, and he was born a Jew, and he will leave the world a Jewish person. And I don't have any particular comment on that. And I do understand that he's trying to show that he is a reformed prisoner. But one thing that is also tied into this giant web of lies is that David Berkowitz is eligible for parole. And he was sentenced to 6 life sentences, which have to be served consecutively, but he is eligible for parole, and he has mandatory parole hearings every 2 years. And he openly said that he wanted to cancel his parole hearings. But again, that is not something that is completely true, because in the 1999 interview that he did with Larry King, he said that he had the parole paperwork and he was talking about it on national television, saying that firstly, he has 6 consecutive life sentences, so even if he is granted parole, he has to go through the process multiple times. But something that I didn't completely understand, but he said that his life sentences are overlapping, so essentially it is life without parole. That is almost a direct quotation from David Berkowitz. So by refusing the parole hearings, he's not actually doing any benefit. In short, perhaps he views them as a waste of time. And this just ties into how I ultimately ended up agreeing with Thomas Viborg Thune by stating that David Berkowitz is still a manipulator. Even though he's reformed, even though he's probably genuinely helping people in prison, he's still a manipulator, he's still a liar, he's still someone who's trying to live in the giant web of lies that he has created. And I think that all ties into this type of childhood neglect, about just not being able to bond with people, about not having strong relationships, not being able to hold down strong employment. He had numerous jobs: security guard, working on air ducts, even being a failed policeman, all types of things where he is just dealing with instability in his life. So the way that he would create some type of illusion around the instability would be to spin webs of lies. But that's just my take on the subject. And overall, I am not convinced at all that there were multiple shooters in the Son of Sam case. And if you would like to dispute that with me, you can put it in the comments section down below. And I also would like to give a big shout out to Manny Grossman, who hosts the program Undercurrents. He used to just have the name Manny Grossman here on YouTube. He did numerous videos about the Son of Sam, and some of them are still available on his YouTube channel. And as I was going through these different videos here on YouTube, I saw Manny in the comments section, and he was pointing out just that reminding us of some of the things that he had shared on his YouTube channel, on his true crime walk and talk videos. And that is that Maury Terry provided certain pieces of inaccurate information in his ultimate evil theory. And I would like to address some different things by Maury Terry, almost sensationalizing and blowing the story out of proportion. For example, he said that the murder of Stacy Moskowitz was one of the most famous shootings in American history, and I hardly can accept that. I just don't see how he could put one of the Son of Sam shootings on par with the presidential assassinations, for example, the shooters like John Wilkes Booth, or Charles Guiteau, or Leon Czolgosz, or how about Lee Harvey Oswald, and then Lee Harvey Oswald being shot by Jack Ruby? How could you even compare something like that in terms of the most famous shootings in American history? And that just seemed like a reporter who was trying to attract an enormous amount of puff for his particular story and his book and his theory. And I would like to conclude with something that I did share in my previous episode on the Son of Sam. I really only have one episode about the Son of Sam on this channel called it's about Sons of Sam, the Netflix documentary, and a direct response to that. And I was watching an episode of Lionel Nation, a YouTube channel that I used to follow, hosted by the radio host Lionel, and he said that he knew Maury Terry personally, and that Lionel agreed with Maury Terry's theory in The Ultimate Evil, but the problem was that Maury Terry didn't know how to share it with the general public. And I'm going to kind of dispute that right now by saying that I think that it was more or less just something that was very entertaining. It was very eye-catching. It gets people thinking in a lot of ways. Could there be cults working in the shadows? Could there be this type of cult, the 22 Disciples of Hell, that are connected to the Process Church, and that this is going nationwide, and that this type of cult and activity is operating in California, and that the Manson family is involved in the 1974 murder of Arliss Perry, and it's all connected. And I even talk about this in some of talk about this to a certain extent in my own book, Killer on a White Horse, A Story of the Evening Watchman. And that is a novel, but there's definitely this thing. They call it this. I call it the Satanic Network in the book, and the characters call it that. That's why I said they. But that was definitely an inspiration for that. But that's fiction. That's fiction, and it's meant to show that I was just trying to zone in on the fact that there is this very large idea that has been created, but was it factual? And overall, I definitely have to lean toward David Berkowitz being the lone gunman in this particular case. But what do you think? I would like to know your ideas in the comment section down below. And to longtime BBOR listeners, there is the book Killer on a White Horse, and I am currently writing the sequel to that one, the full-length novel sequel. So please look out for that in the near future, as well as announcements about the book in the near future. And you can follow along with all of that here on BBOR. Once again, hit the like button, subscribe. It really helps out the channel. And I want to know your feedback mostly, but also you can drop your requested topics, requests for future episodes, questions about the Zodiac Killer and Jack the Ripper that can be worked into episodes on Ripper Wednesday and Zodiac Monday. I just want to know what you guys think. And one more time, the email address is blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. You can also get my Facebook page. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And there is always BlackBoxNed88 over on Instagram. And I will see you there for the bonus podcast. Until next time.